Hello, and welcome to the final talk in the US West Coast series of talks in the 2021 set of the Open UK Future Leaders training sessions. Please note this meeting is being recorded and will be made available soon afterwards on our YouTube channel. First, a little about the Open UK Future Leaders Group. The Future Leaders Group is a collection of individuals who are interested in open technologies, including open source software, open hardware, and open data. It includes a wide range of people that work in technology, intellectual property, outsourcing, procurement, data, coding, and innovation, as well as private practice lawyers and in-house counsel that work in the technology sector and related fields. It operates under the direction of the Open UK Legal and Policy Committee and has a clear purpose to bring together and develop leaders in future legal and policy matters relating to open technologies and to support and further the mission of the Legal and Policy Committee. The Future Leaders Group is currently co-chaired by me, Robert Brunels, and I'm from Phil Fisher, and Katie Gibson from Bristow's, and we're both lawyers advising on technology and commercial matters. The group is always open to new ideas and to new members, whether getting involved in all of our activities or just dipping in and out of our various projects, so please do get in contact if you'd like to get involved. And for today's session, we're pleased to be joined by Luis Villa. Luis is a lawyer, executive, and former software developer, specializing in open source licensing, product counseling, technology transactions, and community strategy. He is the co-founder of Tidelift, who are creating a new way to support and use open source software. Before Tidelift, Luis worked in some of the most high-profile technology projects in the world, including the Wikimedia Foundation, Mozilla, on the Google Oracle case, while at Greenberg Traurig, and at Simeon. He has served on the board of directors of the Open Source Initiative and as an invited expert on the Patents and Standards Interest Group at the World Wide Web Consortium and on the legal working group of OpenStreetMap, along with being a founding member of the GNOME Bug Squad, along with being elected to several teams on the GNOME Foundation board. As usual, we'll have a chance for questions and a bit of a Q&A session at the end, so please do pop them in the chat and we'll invite you onto voice and video to ask them yourself if you'd like to. Luis, welcome to our session today and thanks for joining us, and over to you to talk about open source and licensing in 2021.
Thank you for having me, Robert. I appreciate it. We're going to talk about the state of open licensing in 2021 today. And it's an interesting topic because some of the things here are very foundational, have been essentially unchanged for nearly a quarter of a century now. But in other ways, open licensing is as much in flux right now as it has perhaps ever been. And so I want to talk about that tension, both the history and some of the basic building blocks today. So what are our goals today, besides just talking about licensing? The first one is I want to give you the tools to understand, especially if you're new to open licensing, but even if you're not, hopefully this is a useful framework to help you understand what's going on. The second thing that I'm going to try to do is not bore you to tears, because reading licenses out loud is a sure way for people to say, oh, suddenly my connection is bad, I'm going to drop off the call. So I'm going to try not to lose anyone that way. This has been in the news a lot lately. These are just a selection of small headlines from the past few months or a year and a half. MongoDB switching its license from something that was open to something that was arguably open to something that was not open. Elastic being changes. We'll summarize some of these in more detail, especially if you fell asleep in 2018. First of all, congratulations. You picked a very good time to fall asleep and not wake up. You've missed a couple really rough years. The most important thing that you've missed is licensing changes. May have been other headlines in the news, not sure what they were. The important ones that you missed while you were asleep since 2018 are licensing changes. Among others, as I already mentioned in the headlines, MongoDB, big publicly traded company, announced the server-side public license, revised the server-side public license, withdrew from public consideration the server-side public license, all in a matter of a few months. A project called Redis, very important to distributed projects, was first available under something called the Commons Clause, and now at least partially under the Redis source available license. Elasticsearch and Kibana, very big, important projects for people who are doing search in their databases, which is to say nearly everybody, was under an open source license and is now under the server-side public license and the Elastic license, another custom license. Grafana, a big project for showing logs, went from being under the Apache license to being under the Affero General Public License. And a widely used Python project called VCR is under something called the Hippocratic license. Those of you familiar who have doctors in the family may recall that the Hippocratic oath says to do no harm. The Hippocratic license tries to bring that into the software space. So this is a space with a lot of ferment. I think you would be hard pressed in the 10 years or so before this. If you looked at licensing headlines from 2009 to 2019, you would have seen very few license headlines in the open source press. It was a period of relative stability. In the past 2 years, we've seen all of this, and this is just the highest level headlines. There are even more projects attempting similar things. So let's talk today about first why you should care, and then some of the tools to understand why it is that these things matter. So the key thing here is that, for those of you who are lawyers, this may already be intuitive, but licenses and open source are really foundational to modern technology. If a company runs around and says, we are not using open source, that's actually a red flag. That tells you that that company doesn't actually know what they're using, because the modern technology that does not use open source in some way, shape, or form is an incredibly rare bird. Right before I started Tidelift, I was involved in an M&A deal where they kept insisting that they didn't have any open source. This was something that would have been a matter of course. And in fact, I had been brought in, but had been told, oh yeah, we need you to do diligence, but it should be pretty much rubber stamp. We don't expect any problems. Weeks into the M&A, they kept saying, we don't use any open source. And that became a red flag that almost killed the deal, because it really led everyone involved to question, do these people know what they're doing? Because if they don't think they use any open source, they may not have any idea of what it is that's actually going on in their company. It turned out at the end of the day that they were, one, no surprise, using open source. Two, they were using it, in fact, in such a restricted way that it was not, in fact, it was somewhat understandable that they didn't know. But that was a really rare bird. And like I said, nearly closed the deal, nearly killed the deal. So open source is foundational to all of modern technology. And it's licenses that open source, for better or for worse, is based on. We as modern enterprises, as modern businesses, need to know that we have the permission to use all this open source that we grab from everywhere. And licenses are the way that we do that. Like I said, this is both for better and for worse, because it's a little bit twisted things so that we often think only of the licenses and not of all the rest that goes around it in the community. So first thing we're going to do here today, now that I've told you why open source licenses is important, we're going to dissect them a little bit. And I'm going to go through these pretty rapidly because I really want to get to discussion and Q&A. But we're going to dissect these a little bit to help you understand what makes a modern open source license tick. The first thing to do if you are faced with analyzing or dissecting an open source license API, clearly defined.io. These are projects that exist to help your technical people pull from databases of licensing information. And of course, there's commercial support. My company, Tidelift, offers this as well as a variety of others that you can go to help you understand licensing issues that are in front of you. So when you're assessing a license, so step 0, you've decided, no, I'm not going to call on these other resources. I'm going to do this myself, for better, for worse. So what's the first thing you have to do when looking at any license? Well, you have to look at what rights are granted. This over here on the left is text from the simple public license. It says you get the royalty-free right to use the software, make derivative works of it, copy and distribute it. These are the core rights that all open source licenses have: use, modify, distribute. There are similar grants in essentially every open source license. So step 2 of analyzing is that virtually every open source license, though not necessarily everyone, there are some that do not require these, have standard permissive, what we call permissive conditions. And these conditions are notice. You have to tell recipients what licenses they've received code under. And attribution. You have to notify the recipients about name or other information about the copyright holder. If you have an iPhone or an Android device, and I assume that's basically all of you, if you go deep enough in the menus, you will find what I've shown you here on the right-hand side of the screen, listings of open source licenses in each of those devices, which are the result of these standard permissive conditions. In order to comply, if you have hundreds of open source licenses, you have to do hundreds of notice and attribution requirements. I call these standard because essentially all common open source licenses include some variants on these conditions. There are a few, sometimes called the zero licenses, Creative Commons 0, MIT 0, BSD 0, which do not require these, but those are so far sort of rare in the wild. Why are these called permissive? They're called permissive because these conditions are not considered onerous. They come out of the academic tradition of open source of, hey, do whatever you want, just like academia, just like knowledge, but you need to at least say who gave you permission to use it. So licenses with only these conditions are referred to as permissive. As a practical matter these days, we usually address these requirements with tooling, with software, because the number of licenses and libraries is too large for manual intervention. If you're generating one of these lists on the right-hand side by hand, that is a terrible pain and error prone. And so most large companies use some sort of tooling to help them generate these attribution files. I'm going to skip this because it's just an example of the language. Actually, I will read this real quick. You must ensure that everyone who gets a copy of any part of this software from you, with or without changes, also gets the text of this license or a link to the license. This is a simple permissive attribution rule. Essentially says you must give people this information. Sorry, notice rule. You must give people this information. Step 3. Like I said, virtually all open source licenses have these give you basic permissions, require very basic notice and attribution. The other common set of requirements is sometimes called copyleft. Copyleft means that someone who uses and then redistributes source under a copyleft license must share alike. In other words, they must allow the recipient to access the source to the distributed software under the same terms. Key questions when you're analyzing these: in what situations do I have to share alike? Usually this means what counts as distribution, and what code do I have to share alike? In other words, what is the scope of the obligation? Do I have to share all of the code? If less than all of the code, how much less? So here, again, from the simple public license is an example of copyleft terms. If you distribute the software, you must give back to the community by providing the source code in a form that is easy to get and best to modify, and licensing it to everyone under substantially similar terms without adding further restrictions. Note here, again, the motivation to give to the community and that everyone receives permissive stuff. You don't have to share the source code. You do have to give the notice, you do have to give the attribution, but you don't necessarily have to share the source code. So for example, much of what's in iOS, even though it's based on permissive licenses, is not actually available to the public, though some of it is. But the some of it that is available simply because Apple chooses to do that as a matter of policy, not because they're forced to do it by the license. So what kind of conditions can trigger the obligations to share under a copyleft? In the 1990s, it was most of these licenses were triggered by the distribution of compiled software. So if you put the software on a floppy disk, or in the language of GPLv2, if you put it on a tape drive, those of you who are older will remember the days when we occasionally put software on tapes in order to distribute it. The key there was that you had to really give it to another person, usually on a physical media like a tape, a CD-ROM, a floppy drive. In the mid-2000s, this started to shift. The Affero GPL says that you are required to share when someone interacts with the software remotely through a computer network. This was catching up to, oh, in fact, a lot of software these days is just distributed through a network over the web. We have to do something to match the requirements to the changing nature of the software industry. In the late 2010s, early 2020s, people started to say, if it's used at all, you have to share the source. These licenses have not been approved by the Open Source Initiative, which is the body that, generally speaking, defines open source, but nevertheless, some of them are out there. Step 3 continued. Once it's been triggered, because you distributed it on a floppy disk or over the network, what must be shared? This goes from weak to network, again, only the modifications to the original code, all the way to very broad scopes of things that are interacted with. This particular clause that I will not bore you to tears by reading talks about files. The unit here is the file of source code. A broader one says you must include, from a more recent license, says that you must include any elaborations or implementations that contain any licensable portion of the work. This is as broad, arguably, as copyright law allows. Finally, and this is where things are starting to change a lot in the past few years, you have to identify any restrictions that go beyond copyleft. For a long time, if somebody said open source, it was pretty plainly clear that the most restrictive thing that you might see would be a copyleft requirement. In other words, sharing the source. But there's a growing number of licenses, still small, still not widely adopted, that are sometimes incorrectly referred to as open because the source code is available, but they're not open in the sense approved by the Open Source Initiative. The two main categories are what is sometimes called non-commercial or non-compete licenses. These prohibit commercial use or prohibit certain kinds of commercial use. Often, in particular, they're aimed at companies like AWS that provide a hosted version of the software. There's also what are sometimes called ethical or moral licenses that prohibit use of the software for unethical purposes under various definitions of what's unethical. There aren't really many centralized lists of these yet. And so unlike where you can go to the Open Source Initiative for a list of widely used open source licenses, or SPDX, the Software Product Data Exchange Standard, that's got an even more comprehensive list of open source licenses. There's no central place, though there's starting to be a list at ethicalsource.dev of ethical licenses. Examples of some of these include, I mentioned earlier, the Hippocratic license. The current version of the Hippocratic license, instead of do no harm, focuses on international human rights guidelines. The Commons Clause is an addition to standards licenses that said, in effect, don't compete with the commercial sponsor of this project. Do whatever you want as long as you don't compete, which is antithetical to how open source has been defined for 20-some years. So to quickly review, what is it you need to do when you're looking at a license you've been told is open source? There's always at least some responsibilities because of attribution and notice. The critical variables it matters when you're assessing copyleft, because what the scope is will depend based on whether it's C or Java, internet distributed, mobile distributed, or in the rare case where it's still distributed on a floppy. This is complicated, but again, help is available. To understand where this is going in 2021, we need to do a bit of a dive into the history, though. Since the late 1990s, there have been two major currents in how we think about free and open source software. On the left, this is the logo of the GNU project. GNU stands for GNU's Not Unix. It's a recursive acronym. The GNU project and the Free Software Foundation, closely affiliated with the GNU project, stood for a view of the world in which software source code availability was closely tied to human freedom. The idea was that if we all had access to source code, we would be more empowered to use our computing devices and therefore have more freedom as human beings. In slight contrast was what became known as openness, sponsored primarily by the Open Source Initiative, whose green logo is on the right. And the Open Source Initiative pushed for a slightly different view. In its view, software source code access was a utilitarian good. It would help software become better by allowing for people to find more bugs, deploy it more cheaply, deploy it more quickly. All of these things were enabled by the licenses and therefore would make the world a better place, but it would do it through a very pragmatic view of what would happen to the software. Now, there was a lot of overlap here. The Free Software Foundation folks also thought the software would be better, though they did admit that even if the software was pragmatically worse, buggier, or less capable in some dimension, it would still be better for humans because they would be able to fix those bugs, add those features themselves. The Open Source Initiative similarly said, hey, this will be great for individuals, but that wasn't really their focus. Their focus was business. Now, as a practical matter, in fact, again, for much of this time, there was a lot of fireworks. People didn't like each other on either side of this divide, but the actual tools, the actual licenses chosen were identical. The Open Source Initiative endorsed the Free Software Foundation's licenses, and the Free Software Foundation endorsed many licenses that were not copyleft. So, and through the 1990s and 2000s, the alignment was not just around licenses. There were so many developers sort of falling from the sky because of the dot-com boom and the increased access to computing, that even though people thought about, oh, am I a free software developer or an open source developer, the pie was big enough to go around. Nobody was concerned that well, the open source folks are growing, because the free software camp was growing as well. And again, there was a lot of overlap. There was plenty of money to go around. So lots of free and open source software was getting written. And again, embarrassment of riches. So the ethics and the business stuff were mostly aligned. And different licenses help differentiate. If you wanted to be more free, you could choose stronger copylefts. If you wanted to be more business oriented, you could choose more permissive licenses. The net result was that there was very little tension between the two camps for a while. And there were some rhetorical fireworks, but not, people didn't really have to choose very hard though. Times have really changed though, and I think there are 4 key reasons why they have changed. And if you understand those 4 key reasons, you'll really understand a little better why there's so much new fragmenting and such a plethora of new licenses. So the first thing is that cheap and easy became mandatory. When open source started really taking off in the late 1990s, cheap and easy was something that was nice to have because frankly, lots of software was a pain in the neck. You had to negotiate licenses, it was very expensive. Getting a server was literally $1 million proposition. And so being cheap and easy was a really big feature for free software. And you could make a nice business out of making things that had previously been hard, now cheap and easy. Now cheap and easy is table stakes. Cheap and easy is everywhere. And so lots of companies have been forced into they didn't really do it. It's like this kid didn't want to sit down for this photo shoot. You really had to, a lot of companies did open because they thought it would help with marketing. They thought it would help get developer mindshare, but they didn't really want to do open. And so that tension has caused a lot of companies like Mongo, like Elastic, oh, now we've got shareholders, but we're still doing this open thing. We don't really want to do that. Let's change it. So change number 2 is that the platforms have embraced open source. Late 90s, early 2000s, Microsoft was known to say that open source was a cancer, that open source was communism. And so you could be an open source business and you weren't competing with Microsoft. You weren't competing with the biggest platform around. These days, every platform has embraced open source. Amazon is built, AWS is built on open source. Microsoft Azure is built on open source. Google Cloud Platform is built on open source. And so if you want to compete with the platforms, maybe open isn't a good tool. Maybe, in fact, you as a vendor want a weapon to use against the platforms. And this is where things like the commons clause come in that say, look, if you're not competing with me, great, have a good time. But if you're competing with me, which is to say, if you are Amazon or Microsoft or Google, then we want a legal weapon to use against you. And that has caused a lot of the proliferation of business licenses, where previously business was just fine with doing open. Change number 3, open is everywhere, including bad things. These smokestacks probably have some open source attached to them. Militaries use open source everywhere, and a lot of people are very uncomfortable with this kind of thing. We're in a time where a lot of people feel very active, feel very much like politics impinges on their everyday lives, and it is no surprise that people who are asking questions about what are my values, how do I interact with capitalism, are also saying, wait, so my open source software can be used by anybody, even the bad guys? And this is where you get this sense of, I think, often very genuine moral outrage, is where people are casting about and saying, what are the tools that are available to me as an individual to help change the system? And open source licensing, we've been telling them for 20 years, open source licensing helps you change the system. And so it's perhaps no surprise that people are now taking us up on that and saying, oh, well, great, let's change the system. Finally, I think the important thing to realize is that free and open source licenses no longer cause friction. There was a time, for a long time, where free and open source licenses were still scary to businesses, were still scary to lawyers. And so they caused a useful friction that businesses and individuals could use to cause people not to use the software. Right? Because at the end of the day, part of control, part of power is to be able to say over your software, is to be able to say, I don't like these people. I want them to at least have to think twice about it. Right? So if you didn't like militaries, you chose a very restrictive open source license like the Affero GPL, and militaries were going to say, I don't know about that. Well, guess what? The military uses GPL software all the time now. So that friction that was present is no longer present. Similarly, if you didn't like Microsoft, choosing the GPL was a very good way to spite Microsoft. That's not the case anymore. And so we have come to find that in many cases, people want friction. They thought they didn't, but it turns out that they really do. And so this proliferation of new licenses, of new conditions, remember, to go back to how we analyze a license, one of the key things we have to look at is what are the conditions? And it turns out that people want friction, they want power, they want control. And as a result, we're seeing a proliferation of new conditions in our licenses. So do new licenses actually solve these problems? Just as an example, I've talked a few times about the commons clause. It says, without limiting other conditions, the license does not grant you the right to sell the software. It's always been considered sacrosanct in free and open source software. Even in free software, the folks who are nominally sort of anti-business, it was a sacrosanct right that, of course, you could resell the software. And this was deeply tied. It was assumed that if the source code was available, you could sell it. Many of these other licenses, license, zero, polyform, sever those rights. They say you can look at and even modify this source code, but you can't sell what you've created. And that's a key attempt to regain power, regain control, create a little more friction. Similarly, the moral problem, the ethical open source licenses say, for example, licensees shall use the software in a manner consistent with the human rights principles, where the human rights principles are defined, among other things, as the United Nations Universal Declarations of Human Rights. This is, again, an example of folks trying to reclaim control. I think in a world where people feel less and less empowered, less and less under control of their own lives, it should not feel surprising that people are trying to regain control in the ways that they can, including through licenses like this. Perhaps the first popular one of these was something called 996 ICU, which was a Chinese protest against Chinese labor practices. Fascinatingly, this is one of the most starred repositories on all of GitHub as a way of showing support for that protest, even if the license is probably a pretty ineffective way of controlling that. This text here is from the Hippocratic license. There's a couple of licenses called the Atmosphere software licenses, which attempt to control the use of software by companies that invest in carbon emissions. And again, I'm sure we're going to see more of a proliferation of these. I think the key to understanding these, and then we'll go quickly into our conversation with Amanda and others, for the authors of the software, this is not some kind of devious attempt to fool you. There is, I think, a strain here of, and this does come up in the marketing sometimes, oh, those people are trying to fool you into thinking that these things are open source. It's definitely happening. There's definitely some marketing speak that confuses things a little bit. But the key thing to understand about these folks who are both writing and using these new licenses is that they're trying to take back control in a world where the licensing norm is everything is cheap and easy, everything is low friction. They're trying to fight back against that norm. And I think that's it's a more productive way for us to look at this problem through this lens of, okay, they want to take back control. Is that a kind of control I care about? Is that a kind of control I need to care about, right? Instead of just saying this whole thing is a cancer, trying to look at it from a more, putting yourselves almost in their shoes a little bit. You may not like it. It may make a lot of sense for you to reject it. And indeed, I think when we're remembering that this isn't about you, this is about these threads of history that have come through, right? These battling, the FSF and the OSI have been battling for 25 years in some sense. And, trying to take that step back and realize these licenses aren't personal. They're not they're not trying to, trick you. They're just trying to create some control where there isn't one. So the solution for you, look, if it is standard open source, is defined by the open source initiative, use it. If it isn't, you need to understand it, you need to negotiate, or you do need to retain the ability to walk away. But in that sense, it's no different from any other software license that there is. All of us who are attorneys negotiate software licenses all the time, and we should learn to see these as yet another instance of that. These clauses may or may not work for our clients. We have to be thoughtful about them. We have to be ready to reject them because often that is going to be the right thing for our clients. But, I think it's a more useful bucket to put them in than just rejecting them all out of hand. With that, thank you. Good luck in negotiating this. Much more complex world. And I will try to figure out how to stop sharing in Blue Jeans so that we can have a little bit of a conversation in the chat. Stop sharing. There we go.
Thanks so much, Lewis. It was really interesting. I think, we're having a bit of an open Q&A session now, I think is the idea. I don't know how we quite want to do this, but Amanda, do you want to sort of lead off on some of the questions we've had in the comments or just make some general observations and comments?
Yeah, I agree and disagree with Lewis. And we've known each other for a decade plus, right? So we know already before we started this conversation that we agree and disagree.
Getting closer to 2.
I think there's a point in your slide where you talk about the two kinds of licensing. You talk about the non-commercial and you talk about the sort of ethical type licensing, the Hippocratic type licensing. And in that slide, you talk about them being open. You say that they're not open source within the open source initiative's definition, and I think that's problematic. And I think it's problematic because it does cause confusion. Now, I don't have a problem per se with people doing proprietary licensing, but it's either open or it's proprietary as we stand. And I think this is where the confusion is engendered, where people use those open terms for licenses that don't meet the open source standards, the definition, don't have OSI approval. And I think that's been used in a way that's very negative by business. So if we look at the commercial piece first, I think that the taking back control is about taking back control where you haven't worked your business model out when it comes to the commercial piece. And I've put loads of people off open sourcing their core software as a lawyer when they didn't have an adequate business model to back it up. And I know there's a lot of perception now that the drive towards proprietary licensing and that shift in what many would see as the wrong direction and the doubling down on open, when in fact you're not doubling down on open at all, you're moving to a proprietary license and being disingenuous. I think there's a perception, whether it's right or not, that a lot of that is caused by financial drivers like the VC funding, and that has pushed people away from open into proprietary, which in itself is fine, but it's the way it's done, the sort of disingenuous implication that these are still open licenses when they're not, and there's a whole sort of dressing it up. So I've probably drafted more proprietary licenses than you've had hot dinners, right? I was a lawyer for 25 years. I only really found open source in the last decade of those 25 years, right? So I spent 15 years doing hundreds per year of proprietary licenses. So I've done more than my fair share. And there's nothing wrong with that. Personally, I believe that open does more for sustainability. I think it does more for all of us as a population. And I have reasons that I would advocate for it. But as a commercial or a legal advisor, if you are trying to build a business and you don't know how you're going to get revenue, until you've worked that out or have some semblance of an idea, you shouldn't open source it, right? So I'm not necessarily blindly telling people to open source. But if you're not on an open source license, don't pretend you are. Don't engage a community and take the benefit of the community and then shift and make them feel used and abused from that commercial perspective. And I think blaming the cloud providers, which is something I first experienced a decade ago, because Canonical was one of the first.
You were on the cutting edge
right?
of fighting with the cloud providers.
I think. And we had very specific reasons why, as a business, we were able to continue, i.e. we had a wealthy funder founder. And that I don't think was entirely transparent to the rest of the world. And he's told me I can say what I want to about it, so he trusts me. We were able to continue because of that. And, you know, the organization has spent the last decade working out how it shifts itself to be able to make revenue while still being an open source organization and stayed true to its principles. I think that may have been a bad thing for some of the open source world, because I don't know that everybody understood the problems we were having as one of, if not the first company to go through this with the cloud. And frankly, Canonical took 76% of the cloud market almost overnight, but we didn't generate the revenue because we were giving it away. And, you know, it was terrible at the time. I think Mark actually describes it as financially and emotionally draining. It was really tough. And they've had to go through a lot to get that back. Now, what I've seen in looking at a lot of podcasts and little blogs around the founders who have shifted their organizations, and I'm not going to name and shame because it is shaming, is a lot of them didn't understand. You know, they couldn't name the OSI in their podcast. They get the name wrong. They say things about open source licensing that are clearly wrong, and they just haven't understood what they've got themselves into. And in a way, why should they, right? Because that's their, you know, they're developers. They're not open source licensing people. On the other hand, if you are going to build a business and rely on something, you ought to understand it. So just one thing more or less. So I think that's caused this non-commercial problem. I think there is also an issue around blaming the cloud companies, and I'm going to stand up for them here, because the perspective of open source is that there is no discrimination. You know, I've just been working on a kids course teaching kids this, and there's no discrimination against field of endeavor, and that's for a reason, and that was intended. So what we've got is this business model issue where the cloud companies are technically doing nothing wrong. Ethically, morally, it's a whole different debate, but technically under the licensing, they're doing nothing wrong. There is a bigger conversation about the cloud companies and around that layer where they're able to take advantage of open source and not give back, and about opening up and removing lock-in and lock-out in clouds. And it's the same kind of conversation we had 10 plus years ago around things like operating systems and opening those up. And I don't think you fix that by changing the open source definition. I think you fix that by looking at competition and antitrust law if the companies themselves don't open up. And we're already seeing them start to open up. And I believe that's a precursor to the competition authorities getting involved. And it will be their way of cutting it off at the pass because they've learned. The whole ethical piece is entirely separate, but I'm going to let Lewis respond to that.
So actually, I don't think that's a lovely note to transition on, because I don't think it's that separate, actually, right? Like, I think part of what's happening here is is that the people perceive that there are gaps in what governments are doing, right? And because I think you're totally right, like these licenses are a pretty ineffective way. Like, put aside whether they're the right thing. They're like, antitrust would be a much better tool to get at many of the same goals, or antitrust in theory, antitrust as but antitrust as it is essentially practiced right now, right, is not. And if, I mean, whatever else you may think of antitrust, it's, I think, clearly ineffective at achieving some of these goals as it is currently implemented, right? And so similarly, I think you see, things like the atmospheric license. I'm sure that if you ask the atmospheric license people, they would say, like, yes, if governmental climate initiatives were effective enough, this license is a terrible way to try to solve the climate problem, but it's the only tool that I as an individual have because I feel like governments are letting me down, right? And similarly, I think for some of these cloud providers, CEOs would say, well, yeah, I'd love to just rely on antitrust, but I can't rely on antitrust, so I'm taking what control I have over my own destiny. Like, this is the tool I've got, because antitrust is not a tool that's actually working.
Right, so hang on. So go to that point, Lewis. If they want to take control, they had control and they chose to give control away. They weren't dragged to a burning fire and held over it to open source their code. They made a choice. Now, it might have been the wrong business choice, but they made a choice.
I think that's a fair point. I think there's two things that I want to say to that, though, and these get back to some interesting earlier points you were also making. I mean, the first one is simply, I'm not actually sure how much of a choice. The developer mindset is so focused on, can I get it for free off the internet, that the bar to clear if you are a new entrant for being proprietary from day one is very, very high. You have to have an outrageously good value proposition. And so a lot of businesses, and this is what I was trying to get at, I think perhaps inartfully in one of these slides, is that it used to be that if you were cheap and easy, that was like a market differentiator, right? And so, and now cheap and easy is table stakes, right? And so open source, I think a lot of these CEOs, if you ask them, they would say, no, I didn't actually have a choice. I had to be open source in order to get my product to market. Whether or not that's true, like, I think is a whole different and frankly not that interesting discussion, but I think there's at least that perception. I think the other thing, and this gets back, Amanda, to what you were saying about the CEOs don't know, they're not attorneys.
You're breaking up, Lewis.
I hope now I've got green bars again. Okay.
Yeah, you said
perfect.
CEOs.
Sorry about that.
You said CEOs don't understand, they're not attorneys, and then you disappeared.
Right. Yeah, they're not attorneys. I think it's really like one of the key differences is that in some sense, open source won, right? Like, open source was, if you got involved in open source 20 years ago, it was like you had like fought and clawed and like you had learned all this stuff the hard way. And now it's just in the air, right? Which means that for a lot of people, like, there's definitely, don't get me wrong, and I don't, again, oversimplify it for the purposes of a short talk rather than all day seminar. There's definitely some there. You quoted without you said something about doubling down on open source, which is like there was a blog post, again, I won't name and shame, but you can Google double down on open source and you will probably find this blog post that was very much not open, right? It was very much, we are closing this stuff off and we're going to call it doubling down on open source. It was pretty transparent. Like it was pretty transparently wrong. It was pretty transparently manipulative. They got called out on it. So I don't want to say that everybody's hands are like perfectly clean here, right? There's definitely bad faith. What our friend Simon Phipps has called the rights ratchet, where you just sort of slowly start taking away rights. And I think that's pretty insidious and bad. And as you say, comes up from a mismatch of business model and licensing scheme. But I think also we have to accept that like open has become so successful that like the percentage of people who do open source development, but who've heard of the open source initiative is vanishingly low, right? I mean, the open source initiative has literally hundreds of members, and there are tens of millions of people with GitHub accounts.
But if you're going to build a business on something and bet the kitchen sink or your house on it or whatever else you're doing because you're an entrepreneur and you have not worked out what you are, I'm going to be really brutal here, you're a fool. You need to know what you're doing and you have to own that, right? And you shouldn't be successful in business if you can't work that out for yourself. So I know that's quite brutal, but I actually mean it. There's another
This may be my West Coastness coming out, even though I'm actually on the East Coast today. But Silicon Valley is littered with billionaires who had no idea what they were doing when they started out.
And good luck.
I have a heart. Like, I think if we raise the bar for entrepreneurship to you have to know 100% of everything that's going on before you start being an entrepreneur, that's a pretty high bar, right?
That's not English. Come on, stop wriggling off the point here. That's absolutely not what we're doing. This is a very fundamental part of your business if you're building a business on software. This is not that you're a massive retail chain that happens to use a little bit of open source here and there. And I had a brilliant conversation. We've got a survey running at the moment, and I had a brilliant conversation with a UK PLC this week, who I will not name, who told me they couldn't do our survey, and they couldn't do it because they don't track what open source they use. And I was talking to them not just because I wanted them to do the survey, but because their usage is high, and I would like to do a case study on them. Yet they do not track what they use. So it shows you there's still a long ways to go, right, in terms of adoption and integration, even though we might say open source is one. I think there's another point that people should understand on the commercial piece. And Lewis and I first started to discuss this, I think, in Barcelona in 2019. And I initially was very open to change and open to whether the open source definition ought to be reviewed, right? And I believe that the developers own the code, not the lawyers. And that if we were no longer if we were forcing something on them that didn't make sense, then we should understand that and change. And there really was no appetite for engagement and involvement in that change. And I believe, I may be wrong here, but I think the SSPL, the Commons Clause, and I think also the Redis public license, or Redis, was it Redis server-side license? I think Heather drafted all three, and I don't think there is broader engagement. I think there's a couple of people like yourself who are interested, but I don't think there is a particularly broad engagement in this, and I don't think Polyform has a lot of lawyers signed up to it. But I could be wrong, Lewis. Is there more of a movement coming out of the West Coast now around this?
You know, I think, I think it's a lot broader on the financing side than it is on the legal side, right? Like there is definitely an organized movement of venture capitalists who are concerned about this. You don't actually need that many lawyers engaged, right? Because it doesn't take that long to draft a. And to be clear, I think these are generally I would rarely advise a client to use these. I don't think they're particularly effective. I just think some of the Sturm und Drang of like everybody getting worked up about it, I think has been blown out of proportion relative to. I think actually one of the things that modern open source does very poorly is it over focuses on a handful of key brand name projects,
Yeah.
even though there are tens of thousands of projects that are in use every day, that just don't get the so when one of these very high profile projects changes their license, it becomes this very big, everybody wants to talk about it, everybody needs to express an opinion, when the vast majority of projects are like, the under the water line of the iceberg
Yeah.
is mostly unchanging. And so to some extent, if I have any regrets about giving this talk, it's actually that it does blow out of proportion perhaps a little bit what the change is. Again, I do think for a long time there was very little change at all. And so going from, essentially zero to, a small amount of change is notable and is worth thinking about. But yeah, I do want to switch gears. We've been talking a lot about the business thing.
Just before
Jorge
we
asked,
just before we move on, because I want to
yeah,
talk to you about the ethical side as well, and then I know some others have got questions. On that business side, I have met developers who rephrase that. I know well some developers who would argue with me because they saw high profile open source developers doing source available work that was open source, and it really has caused a lot of confusion. But you and I are both listed on a Wikipedia page as people who are looking at the review of the OSD and whether that's necessary. And I don't think, yeah, exactly. We're both listed there, but I don't think there's any real traction for that. And I don't think things will change without the legal input, because ultimately it's license dependent, and you will get pockets of people paying what they've been asked to do, being paid to do what they're asked to do, like the Commons Clause, but you won't change a movement without engagement, right? And I don't think there is that engagement there, which is why when we see a high profile change, it is a big flash. But then I'll tell you
yeah,
that I was in a room where I was told that Deloitte had told that one of the cloud providers that there was a major shift happening in open source licensing and everybody was going to be able to do the non-commercial. And that's the problem with it. It creates this sort of rumor mill of people who don't have the detail, and that's why it worries
yeah.
me.
I mean that's fair. I mean, I don't think. Yeah, I'm very curious about this wiki, by the way. You'll have to contact
I
me
will. I'll send
after
you.
the chat with a
Yeah.
link. I mean, I have argued that the open source definition, just simply as a drafting proposition, is like terribly written and needs to be redrafted.
I
But
did. I've spent the summer
you can
trying
do
to.
that without changing the meaning, right?
Yeah.
You know, and so maybe this gets to where there may be a more genuine grassroots movement, is this ethical thing. Jorge asked, and I'm not sure that he is still on the call, but um, Jorge asked, well, what's this about military use and abuse? I, you know, I don't think that the military is abusing in like a legal sense, right? Like, as far as I know, the military complies with open source licenses roughly as well as anybody else, which is to say it's imperfect, but there are lots of people who are like, I don't want my software to be used in killing machines, right? Like that as an ethical proposition for them is important to them, right? And they don't know, in part because, I mean, literally, U.S. military tanks have Red Hat in them, right? And so, like, if you are if your source code is involved in is somewhere in the Red Hat Enterprise Linux stack, like, congratulations, you're involved in and drama opinions on the military are more complicated than that, but like, but for a lot of people, their opinions on the military are not that complicated. And, and similarly, Carbon, like, there are a lot of people who are in the scientific computing community whose code is being used to like model where oil deposits are for more efficient extraction of oil from the ground. And like, I don't know. I mean, if I were in the scientific computing community, I'd be pretty horrified by that.
Yeah.
And that's a bottom up in the way that whatever else the strengths or weaknesses of Silicon Valley is, Silicon Valley VCs are not bottom up kind of people. That is a very like coordinated attack on the commercial protections of open source. And this ethical stuff is much more bottom
So,
up, which means
Lewis,
it may have more lasting power.
you're back.
This is what I
Yeah,
get for coming to the East Coast.
yeah, your wife
This,
is.
my internet just down the tubes.
So I think you're right. I think they're very, very different, which is why I wanted to split the two. And I think you can look to AI on the ethical side and the problems and the utter maze it is when you start to define anybody's ethics, because no two of us are going to agree. One thing that I've suggested to people is to put a notice in the headers of their code if they really it's not binding, it's not like you're creating a license, but at least you're able to flag that you don't want your code used in certain ways as the author. And it's about the only thing that I've been able to come up with that you can do. But I know Lorna is sitting really quietly and patiently waiting to talk to you, so I'm going to duck out. And at some point, you and I will have a longer conversation and we can do it publicly about our differences on this.
Yeah,
Lorna,
I'll take
you
that
mentioned-
prompt.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I work for a cloud provider. We are not Amazon, but we do offer open source, mostly database products as a service. And when you buy those services from us, you're buying the awesome management and charming technical support. You're definitely not buying the open source tool. So we've been affected particularly by the Elasticsearch license change, and we're involved in the OpenSearch project, and I think that's a really interesting thing to see where that goes and what we can do as a community, and it's the corporation supporting it. But my question is about, like, is this part of a bigger trend? I mean, is this the beginning of every single vendor open source project going the same way? And as for us as developers in the community, as contributors, are there ways that we can either turn back that tide or be part of a better outcome?
Oh, that is so. I think that's a great question, and I am not I do not have my crystal ball with me. I left it on the West Coast. I'm sorry, but a great set of interlocking questions. So I think. So one thing is simply I want to call out for the rest of the audience who hasn't thought about this deeply. You mentioned the phrase single vendor open source, right? And so some open source is very collaborative, many companies, many individuals working together. And you very rarely see license changes in those kinds of communities, both because it's simply technically, legally difficult, but also because people came together around a certain set of agreements, like this is why we're doing this. And so it's hard to get everybody on the same page to make a change, right? So it's hard both from a technical legal sense of you've got to get everybody to sign off on it, and it's hard from a community sense of you got to get everybody to agree as a community. So you rarely see these kinds of license changes in multi-vendor or multi-contributor open source projects. So I do think we're going to see more of it in single vendor open source projects. The pushback is going to be twofold. One, we're simply going to see a lot more skepticism of single vendor open source, right? I think there's going to be a lot more, I think, not just your company, but many of your customers on your are going to be a little more reluctant. They're going to have been burned. I'm getting the little
we've lost you, Lewis.
I'm getting the little reconnecting video.
You're going to be burned, and then that's where it stopped.
You're back. Say it all again.
You're going to be burned. People have gotten burned, right? Like our company, one of the questions we ask when doing provisioning of new stuff that we're going to be very dependent on is, what's the business model? How are these people making money? And if the answer is, oh, they're going to give it away now and figure that out later, then that's a red flag, and we try not to choose those kinds of things. So I think one thing that you're going to see is just a little more pushback on single vendor open source. And I think the other thing that you can do is, so one is just, obviously you're in a situation where if your customers tell you they need it, you can only put up so much of a red flag. So you're in a little bit of a rough spot. But so the other thing is make some of those forks viable, right? So like I mentioned open source in passing in the talk, and Lorna mentioned in her question, Elasticsearch, very big, very widely used project, went away from an open license to a non-open license, and specifically, pretty explicitly because of Amazon. And a whole bunch of companies that had formed around this ecosystem got together and said, we're going to take the last truly open version and we're going to build a new community under a new brand. And frankly, my read so far, Lorna, you might know better, is that this new community is actually more vital and engaged and a healthier community than it was previously, right? That in fact, this provided the impetus. Now, of course, it's early. This has been, 3 months, January, February. So maybe 2 months. Time flies under all this lockdown right now, right? But I think the best thing you can do is remind people that if they screw up, they're going to pay a price. There's going to be competition. And in fact, Elastic's stock price has gone down since they did this very explicitly to prop up the stock price, right? And in fact, they've been penalized for it by the market. So there may be some, in part because Amazon has said, the 800-pound gorilla of the space has said, you know what? We're going to fork this, right? So I would say that the best thing that you all as a company can do is make them pay a price for it. I mean, that sounds, Amanda was joking about being harsh earlier, but this is, they like the VCs who push for that, the shareholders and CEOs who push for that need to see that this is a bad idea, right? Because intuitively, as Amanda said, like they don't really understand all this stuff very well. They've been under an open license, but they never really got why, right? It was something they sort of chose early on because they didn't really know, or maybe they did know, but it was a bait and switch. Regardless, either way, right? The more Elastic gets, really pounded, not just by press release. Like if the open source initiative issues a press release and says your blog post was very misleading, finger wag. Like, the open source initiative should do that. I'm not saying they shouldn't. But let's be real, a much bigger disincentive to the next person down the road is going to be that Amazon and a laundry list of other companies issued a press release saying, and by the way, we're forking it under the old license, and now you're going to have to compete against all of us, right? Like that is a way bigger, that's a way bigger stick. Carrie.
I think there's a question there as to who actually made the fork, whether it was Elastic who forked their own code or whether an AWS continued with the original. I think it's quite interesting. But one thing that's really interesting in what you're saying is that money talks, and that's what's going to change things. Yet, is money the right basis for us to be measuring open source? Certainly, if you're
let me push back on that. I actually think what I'm saying is that code talks, right? Now, code is often procured by money, right? So we can't ignore money. But what's going to make open search, the fork, successful is the amount of code that's written.
Yeah.
If more code shows up in OpenSearch than in Elasticsearch, OpenSearch is going to win.
And when you say win on what basis? By number of people adopting it, business adopting it, lines of contribution? How do we measure it?
Option. I think a very real possibility for Elasticsearch in the next few years is that OpenSearch just blows them out of the water, right? It's going to be the default that's pushed by every cloud vendor, right? It's going to have more vibrant conferences and community. It's going to have more vibrant community. It's going to rise to the top of more search results because the community interaction is going to help with search engine optimization. I think there's a very distinct chance that Elastic really torched most of their corporate value here, right? And frankly, if I were involved in OpenSearch, especially at Amazon, I would see that. I would never go out and say the purpose of open search is to destroy Elastic's corporate value. But if that happened along the way, and I were Amazon, I would not be sad, right? Like we a story Amanda knows from earlier on, right around when you were getting involved, Amanda. A company came out and sued the Linux kernel broadly, right? Like including IBM. And the story goes, don't know exactly how true this is, but that IBM's legal department said, here's a blank check, salt the earth with these people, right? It wasn't going to be enough to win the case. The company had to literally be bankrupted to cease to exist, because that is how they were going to be made an example of.
Mm-hmm.
And that is exactly what happened. IBM's most expensive, most high profile outside counsel the company still sort of exists, but only in the barest corporate shell form. Elasticsearch is not going to go away in that same way. It's a 13 billion, or I guess now it's 11 billion after they lost value, public company. But like, OpenSearch very much can eat its lunch, and that would be a very big object lesson to the people who are very bottom line motivated.
It's really sorry.
It feels like a really big undertaking. As you know, Elasticsearch integrates with a lot of things and had a lot of code and is changing all the interfaces. So everything that has ever worked needs updating. It's going to take a lot of open source project community coordination and governance to make it work. But yeah, I think we can, and I think it is important. I think it's really pivotal in this whole story about the closing licenses.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's going to be a very interesting thing to do some post. And look, I think OpenSearch is, if anyone is, well, I mean, it's interesting. Not all of these kinds of things have led to forks of this sort, right? Amanda, I take your point about the semantics of who forked what here, and there's a whole other, I'm sure you'll have Pam Chestek on one of these days to talk about trademarks in open source.
Okay.
Perfect. So there's a whole thing, but like in a lot of ways, OpenSearch seems to me to be a sort of paradigmatic, like all the things are set up for it to work. And if it doesn't work, I think that's actually also an interesting data point around, if it can't work here, there's going to be some interesting lessons to be learned about what that means for multi-vendor collaborative open source in the age of these cloud vendor giants, right? I think that's going to tell us something interesting. Either way, right? Either it's going to tell us that Elastic was really, really made a mistake, or it's actually going to tell us something about the limitations of multi-vendor open source and what we can and can't expect of it in the modern ecosystem. Like I said, I think I'd put my money on OpenSearch and not on Elastic if I had to bet. But that will play out over a period of years.
To me too, but that transition to suddenly pick up a project at that size when you have none of the maintainers and none of the committers, because nobody else could commit into that project. It was very single vendor. Yeah. It's the transition that I think is the wobble, not the long-term viability of it. So yeah, watch this space.
There's a really interesting point there about the single vendor companies, and I completely agree with Lewis that the single vendor companies are problematic, and I think their business model, just if you look and you really look, everybody who is successful isn't a single vendor. And I think somebody, I think it was Shannon Ramshire, Shannon Williams said that, one day you've got a business and the next you've got a feature in the cloud. And I think that's a really good way of expressing the risk that you're running if you're a single vendor. But there's a second piece to, I know we're way over time, but there's a second piece to what Lewis is saying that I think is so interesting when we look at what we're doing with Open UK and the report work, the survey and where that's going, is how do we measure the value of open source? And when we look at the surveys and things in the past and how they've worked on a formula, they do lines of code, with numbers of developers, they don't, in an area or in a project, they don't look more broadly than that. And I think there is a need for us to work out better ways of showing value, and that value isn't just about GDP and revenue.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really interesting stuff going on about measuring communities these days that may be, I mean, a lot of it suffers from varieties of you can only measure what you only get what you measure and challenges like that, right? But there's, but there's some interesting stuff going on around there. What was the other thing I was going to say, and maybe this is actually a really good note to end on, is that to some extent what we are engaged on here is almost an article of faith, right? That like we believe, and we have much good evidence now that open works, right? But yet at the same time, it is so against so many of our other instincts under modern capitalism. Whatever you think of modern capitalism, for good or ill, right? It is the water that we swim in. And so it takes a constant refreshing with open to challenge and say, like, no, actually we can do it differently, right? Because it is so much different than anything else in our day-to-day lives. And so there is this, one has to sort of have the mantra of like, no, this is real. It actually works. And, I think actually in some ways these challenges that we're seeing right now are a healthy challenge, right? Because there was a whole generation of open was just taken for granted. We didn't know what the boundaries of it were. Open was whatever was on GitHub. Right. And now we're forcing a generation of CEOs, of VCs and developers to reconsider what that means. Right. And possibly that will mean some changes. I think probably it will not mean significant changes. But if all it does is educate, like that could actually be a really net good outcome. Right. That a new generation like learns that mantra of like actually open actually works. I think that could be really good and healthy for the next couple of decades of open source.
I think that's totally right. And I think it's great that we're ending on something we agree on. I think sustainability, and as we talk more and more about that, will actually be the icing on the cake for open, because I don't believe that you can build technology that's sustainable if it's not open. And I think that's...
Oh boy, so you'll have to invite me back to talk about Tidelift. And instead of licensing and
Absolutely.
I don't necessarily disagree, but so much nuance to unpack there. So thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it. I hope the audience enjoyed.
I was going to say thank you very much for joining us. It was a fantastic talk and a fantastic sort of Q&A session afterwards. So just for everyone's notice, next week we'll be joined by Anand Prasad, who's Senior Software Engineer at Squarespace, and he'll be talking about command line interface design, philosophy and practice. So do go and sign up for that now. Link is on the Open UK events page. Thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you again to Lewis. That's really great. Thank you. Cheers, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. So much
fun. Thanks, Lewis. Bye.
Have a lovely evening.